Thank you for coming on a day that's cold and at a time that's fairly late. But I think we have an extremely exciting event today. This is every semester we try to have one or two book Addas. This is our first of the semester. We will have a second later in the semester. And I'm really excited to be able to welcome Louise Tillin, who's a professor of politics at London King's College in London. And many of you will be familiar with Louise's work. She has written extensively about subnational welfare states in India, about federalism, about anti-poverty programs in India. She's also done a lot of comparative work, comparing poverty programs in Brazil, South Africa, China, as well as in India. And today she's here to talk to us and with us about her latest book, Making India Work, Development of Welfare in a Multi-Level Democracy. And to my knowledge, I'll go out on a limb, but I think this is the first time someone has written a systematic account of the history of the Indian welfare state, which is extraordinary to think that it's actually many people in this room have written extensively about welfare in India, but this is the first time that I think we have a detailed historical account, and it's a very granular, detailed account, as you will be hearing today. So for me, this is really exciting, not just because it's about the Indian welfare state, but because I actually think the topic of what the welfare state in the global South looks like is the single most, and I mean the single most important question of the century in front of us. And a lot of people say, no, it's climate change. But I'm like, you can't address the problem of climate change if you can't address the problem of welfare, right? And all the issues of the welfare state, state capacity, state civil society relations, et cetera, are the same dynamics that we have to contend with in thinking about climate change. So an incredibly important topic. And what makes today really, really, really exciting is I think we could not have put together a more extraordinary set of panelists to be engaging with Louise. And full disclosure, this is not the first time she'll be engaging with some of our panelists. Our first, and I'm going to introduce you in random order, but you'll be speaking in have we agreed on it, or does it matter? Okay, there we go. So, so our first commentator possibly will be Professor Nirja Gopal Jayal, who I introduced yesterday. She was our OP Jindal Distinguished Lecturer, and it was an extraordinary lecture, and we had an amazing conversation. And in different topic, it was about higher education and academia in India. But Nirja has also written extensively about related themes, including a very famous and in my mind path-breaking book called Citizenship and Its Discontent. So we're really thrilled to have Nirja with us today. And then my wonderful colleague, Prerna Singh, who's a professor here in the political science department and a joint appointment with Watson. And Prerna herself has written a book on the Indian welfare state, to be more specific, subnational welfare states in India, Making Solidarity Work, right? Yes. How solidarity works. How solidarity works. I should know. Yes, we had long conversations about the title, so I should remember. And it's a study of subnational welfare states with a theory of where the solidarity that underwrites different models of welfare comes from. And Louise herself has written a lot about subnational welfare states in India, which I think, next to the topic of the Indian welfare state, is the second most important social science topic in the literature. And then finally, we have Yamini Iyer. Some of you already know Yamini well. She's been with us for now. This is her second year back as a visiting research fellow at the center. And we're really excited to welcome you back, Yamini. And Yamini, for a decade, served as the CEO and basically the person running what I think all can agree is the best research think tank in India, the Center for Policy Research. And Yamini has also written extensively on the Indian welfare state, including in its current embodiment in the new 2014 BJP period, and it's a very different kind of welfare state than its predecessor, although, as Louise has argued in her book, in many ways, much like some of the right-wing parties in Europe, the BJP has, in effect, continued to support the welfare state, albeit in a very different form. So I'm so excited to be able to welcome all of you here today. And we're going to begin, Louise, with your presentation. And thank you, Louise, so much for being with us today.
So let me start by saying a huge thank you to Patrick and to the Saxena Centre for inviting me to come and be part of this book, Adda. I can't imagine actually a better group of people to talk about this book with. So it is really, really exciting for me to be able to bring the book to you all at Brown and to continue conversations that I've had with some of you and to start conversations with others that I haven't previously had before. What I want to try and do in the next half an hour is just to give you a bit of a flavour for the book. As Patrick says, it is quite a granular account of the history of India's welfare state, or in fact, I prefer the term welfare regime in the book, over the last 100 years. So I'm not going to talk you through every twist and turn over the last 100 years, but I want to try and pull out some of the big ideas and some of the some of my favourite empirical discoveries that I made in the course of researching and writing the book. But let me start just by setting the scene, why I began thinking about the book, which I did in the tail end of the UPA era in India. I think probably most of you will be aware of the really important changes that took place in the first part of the 21st century, in the way that the Indian state nationally thought about its role vis-a-vis the realization of social rights and the legislation of a series of social rights, starting with a right to information, followed by a right to employment in the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, and followed by a series of other rights: right to education, Forest Rights Act, right to food, enshrined in the National Food Security Act. And it was in this period that I became very interested in what was happening, both at the subnational level, so trying to understand why Indian states were adapting to and in many cases making their own some of these rights-based policies that either emanated at the centre or had their early life in other states, and the kind of a period in which welfare was becoming more central to the kind of fabric of state level politics. Some of this was work I did with colleagues in the Lognity network, resulting in the Politics of Welfare volume, something that we're now revisiting for the last 10 years, plus years of BJP government at the centre, some of which, another project focused on the politics of rights-based policy making at the national level. And as I was engaged in both of those projects, it really struck me that there was very little literature on the prehistory of the rights movement. And that's why I started out on the research that has made its way into this book, something I began a decade ago. Of course, in the intervening period, welfare has perhaps become even more ubiquitous in India's political life. We now see both national and state level parties competing very vigorously over the welfare offer that they make to voters. And we see parties of all ideological persuasions engaging in this competition. And I would say a more vigorous debate about the legitimacy of the state's role in regulating markets to achieve social well-being and welfare. Here you have a bowl of Refri sweets to conjure up the debates that you may be familiar with, whereby political rivals, especially rivals, have accused each other of a politics of freebies that seek to buy voters' allegiance through various inducements, which their critics argue are at odds with other approaches to development, and in particular present a trade-off between investment in infrastructure and investment in welfare. So it's against this backdrop that I felt it was very important to go back in time to understand how welfare has sat alongside a process of economic and political development in India over the last century. So the book, I hope, offers a historical account of what I describe as the foundational architecture of India's welfare regime. It seeks to build on, and I hope to add to, what we know already. There have been a good number of studies which have sought to unpack what Adda at some point described as the paradox of poverty amid plenty, to explain why we see such varied success in rates of poverty reduction, and indeed a literature which has sought to understand the pockets of exceptionalism, especially the story of social democracy in Kerala, which several colleagues in the room today have been at the forefront of unpacking. And what I hope to do with this book is to situate those stories within an overarching history of the idea and development of welfare at an all India level. And perhaps equally important to the task of building out our historical understanding of India's welfarism is the effort to bring India into conversation with the really voluminous work on welfare states in comparative perspective. And that was another of the kind of key provocations for me in starting out in writing this book, the sense that most of the great tomes which have presented models of theories of welfare state development have either entirely ignored India and much of the global south, or treated it rather derisively as a place in which it is so difficult to talk about a welfare state that one can't start to theorize what welfare might mean in the context of a developing economy and democracy. So why this story of neglect? If we look at India's own history, I think there are a number of reasons why scholarship on India's political economy and post-colonial politics have only in the more recent period started to think about welfare as an area of purposive public policy. And one of the key reasons that that is a more recent endeavour is we need to go back to the constitutional moment to understand, and the fact that social and economic rights found their way into the non-justiciable directive principles of state policy rather than into the justiciable fundamental rights. Created the sense that welfare had been downgraded in importance at a founding moment of India's post-colonial journey. Allied to that, I think, has been a fairly pervasive assumption in and beyond India, both that India has lacked a more purposive approach to social policy, either because of a fairly conventional argument that welfare states can only be, there's a kind of sequential theory of welfare state development that assumes that welfare states arise at a certain level of economic development. And so because of a lack of resources, there was no serious set of debates about the creation of a welfare state in India in that immediate post-colonial moment, something which I think in the book show to be quite untrue. Equally, the preeminence of clientelism in the way that political scientists have understood democracy and the political economy of democracy in India has meant that much political scientific attention has been focused on understanding the discretionary disbursement of state resources rather than on understanding the ideas that have laid behind the development of public policy in the field of welfare. So to move on to the content of the book itself, beyond my motivations for writing it, the title, Making India Work, has two meanings. The first is to point to how centrally social policy has been shaped by the conundrum of how to put Indians to work, so to make Indians work, in a context in which the key economic sectors that have driven phases of economic growth, both in the early stages of economic planning with investment in capital-intensive heavy goods industries, and then more recently with service sector-led growth, in which these growth sectors of the economy have not been mass employment generating, which has created the central conundrum that policymakers have had to deal with in designing welfare interventions. The second meaning of making India work has a more territorial connotation. And this perhaps may come as no surprise given the other hat that I wear as a scholar of federalism. But I argue that welfare policies have been quite integral to making India work, both as a national economy and as a national polity. And I point to two key ways in which that is the case. The first, and this is an argument that I make in the first part of the book about the late colonial period, but I think it's also an argument that has great resonance today, and that perhaps is something that might come out in our discussions later, is that the early development of a national architecture of social security was quite bound up in a process of regulating interregional labour market competition, interregional economic competition, in the building of a national economy, an adjunct to nationalist movement more generally, in an effort to avoid what we might think of as a race to the bottom in conditions for labour. So that's the first meaning of the territorial part of this argument. And the second is related to democratic consolidation, and in particular the ways in which policy innovation in welfare has been spurred by the intensification of multi-level electoral competition through a process of political regionalisation and growing competition between parties in power at the state level and at the national level. Again, something which remains very true today. In crafting a kind of analytical framework for thinking about India's story in terms of the origins of its early welfare regime and the process of the expansion of welfare, I found that existing theories, both those which have been applied to India, but also those which are extant in more comparative welfare state research, offered somewhat limited tools for understanding the Indian story. And I propose the following central arguments, which I think move beyond some of the existing framings for thinking about welfare in India. The first is that, at least in the period that the book covers, this may we may think about this differently today, but at least thinking about the mid-20th century, it was the regulation of internal economic competition within India's consolidating national economy that was more important than international competition in producing what now we know as protections for workers in the formal sector. And so this pushes against arguments which have suggested that it was import substituting industrialization which enabled India's state to push some degree of welfare costs onto employers in return for shielding them from international competition. So that's the first argument that I push against. The second is an argument about the class interests that have shaped welfare in India. And here I build on other accounts of India's political economy to emphasize the importance of multi-class interests. And to see India's welfare policies neither as the product of workers' mobilisation, and this is something that the kind of larger body of power resources theories of welfare state origins might lead us to expect, but it's also the kind of hunch that people have used to explain why formal sector workers in India enjoy a certain set of protections. So I suggest, and I'll give you a bit more of a flavour of this, but very rarely have social security policies, at least, been the subject of factory floor agitations. And I suggest that it is much more useful to think about social policies as originating out of a multi-class set of interests, which include employers. So I argue against, for instance, Vivek Chibba's argument in his book in the early 2000s, Locked in Place, in which he suggests that the second part of the Bombay Plan in the mid-1940s was a ruse on the part of capital by employers who were performing an interest in distribution as part of a future model of economic planning. I suggest that it was more than a ruse. And that in fact, and I think I have evidence to suggest that at least in the run-up to and during the Second World War, industrialists were also engaged in the process of negotiation, which led to the kind of crystallization of that mid-20th century set of social security policies. And then the third argument is one about how we think about democracy, and particularly the role of ideology in driving policy change. So linked to that body of power resources theorization is the assumption that party systems organized around labour capital cleavages offer a way of thinking about when and why we might see breakthroughs in terms of the expansion of welfare provision. In this book, I argue that India does not have a party system that is primarily structured either historically or today around a labour capital cleavage. But even if we think of other forms of ideological division that might help us to understand party system competition, such as degrees of statism, that these are less useful than the deepening of multi-level electoral competition in driving welfare state expansion. In fact, at moments of welfare state expansion, there is actually often, rather surprisingly, a good degree, or there has historically been a good degree of partisan cross-party consensus, and it's been the intensification of electoral competition across levels that has driven those moments of expansion. So let me now move on to just give you a little bit of a flavour of the empirical material in the book, and a sense of the kind of three sections of the book. So the first part of the book is entitled Building a National Economy, Regulating Internal Competition. And this first part of the book starts in late colonial Bombay in the 1920s, in the aftermath of the First World War, in the aftermath of the influenza epidemic, and in a context in which India has become one of the founding members of the International Labour Organization, and as an outcome of the Treaty of Versailles is drawn into debates that are taking place in Europe especially about new forms of social policy that might be designed in order to regulate international competition and reduce the threat from Soviet Russia. And it's in this context, I suggest, that we start to see an emerging interest in Bombay presidency among nationalist leaders, moderate leaders of labour. N.M. Joshi plays a particular role here, and to an extent among industrialists, in social insurance. And when I talk about social insurance, I'm thinking first, actually, the first form of social insurance were maternity benefits that were introduced in a number of provinces in the 1920s and 1930s. But it was sickness insurance that became a particular topic of discussion in Bombay as factory owners became interested in finding models for stabilizing the labor force and enabling workers a means of subsistence and medical care in times of ill health to prevent them from needing to return to the village. So great kind of debate around the stabilization of an industrial working class in which this idea of sickness insurance really started to take shape. But the key to understanding why we then move from a debate in Bombay to a national architecture for social security I suggest, lies in the kind of fierce competition that was starting to shape India's textiles industry, one of the two leading industrial sectors, and which was driving a race to the bottom in workers' wages and working conditions, and putting great pressure on mill owners in Bombay as a result. And this map, if you can see, gives you a little sense of the economic geography that I'm talking about. I do have a pointer, I think. I haven't tried this out. So here's Bombay, and the triangles on the map represent centres of the cotton and textiles industry. The diamonds are centres of the jute industry. And so you can see, well, you may not be able to see, but I can tell you that the diamonds, the jute industry, are all concentrated around Calcutta, whereas the triangles are dispersed across the length and breadth of India. And the smaller the triangle, the smaller the centre of cotton textiles industry. And it was these so-called upcountry mills that were able to undercut Bombay in labour costs. And were leading to cycles of rationalisation in Bombay's mills that were driving industrial unrest. And it's in this context that on the eve of the Second World War, industrialists, especially in Bombay, were calling on the British to convene a national conference on industrial and labour policy in order to look at what could be done to regulate these forms of internal competition. And to cut a long story short, the product of these debates was eventually the Employees State Insurance Act, which was legislated on in 1948, before the promulgation of the Constitution, and so legislated on by the Constituent Assembly of India, sitting as the Legislative Assembly. This act is still in force. This introduced the Employees State Insurance Corporation, and a contributory model of sickness insurance. So a model whereby employees and employers paid into a common fund in order to provide medical benefits, hospital treatment, as well as paid sickness leave to workers, industrial workers. And as you can see from the quotes that I've put on the slide, the proponents of this bill in the Constituent Assembly saw it as the nucleus, if you like, of a future Indian welfare state. So Renu Correa says this bill, even if it is not comprehensive enough, is the nucleus of the future social insurance legislation of the country. And the bill was also amended at a late stage to enable it to, in theory in the future, be extended from industrial workers to any other category of worker. And there are ongoing debates today being led by informal sector workers' unions, which are still demanding the extension of the ESI Act to informal sector workers. This is the kind of, the kind of culmination of the debates that I discuss around social insurance that lead us up to that immediate post-colonial moment. And I think it's particularly significant because it is the first moment at which a debate about a different kind of more universal model of welfare was forestalled right at its origins. And I'll just digress a little through one of my favourite anecdotes from the book to explain why. In this slide, you have three of the kind of protagonists that led to the kind of truncated application of the Sickness Insurance Act only to industrial workers. You have B.R. Ambedkar, of course, in the top left, who became the member for Labour on the expanded Viceroy's Executive Council in 1942 in the immediate aftermath of the Quit India movement. And in this position, Ambedkar drove forward the idea of creating a national system of social security, starting with sickness insurance. And he did so by appointing this man, B.N. Adarkar, to write a report with a plan for introducing sickness insurance in India. In preparing the Adarkar, what became the Adarkar report, Adda drew heavily on debates that were being shaped by this gentleman in the bottom right corner, Sir William Beveridge, who authored the Beveridge Report in the United Kingdom, which spelled out the kernel of the ideas which came to characterise the new post-war British welfare state, and especially systems of national insurance and national health service. Ambedkar and Adda were so enamoured by the ideas of freedom from want that were outlined in the Beveridge Report that they sought to bring Beveridge to India to write a Beveridge Report for India. And much to the Viceroy's consternation, got quite far in extending this invitation. Beveridge himself was very keen to come to India. He was planning for a 6-month at least visit, was in the process of interviewing research assistants and finding secretarial assistants for this visit. But eventually the whole plan fell through. And the plan fell through because Ambedkar was absolutely determined that Beveridge should confine his attention only to the situation of freedom for want for the industrial workforce. Whereas Beveridge wanted full canvas to think about freedom from want in India from first principles. And that would include looking at the condition of agriculture. And Beveridge refused these more limited terms, and visit was pulled off. So this, for me, was a very kind of curious finding, really, that it was, in a sense, Ambedkar sitting on the Viceroy's Executive Council during the Second World War, both driving a debate about the need to introduce social security for workers, but also determined to confine that debate to the industrial workforce. And in a sense, it was that vision that prevailed over other visions that were also being debated at the time, especially the Moore Committee report, which envisaged a much more universal form of health service. Those debates were really overshadowed by the what came to be in the Employee State Insurance Act, a much more stratified system of social insurance. So that's the first part of the book. The second part of the book, which is entitled Putting India to Work, moves its gaze to the immediate post-colonial moment and the advent of economic planning. It focuses in particular on the second 5-year plan and the decision to invest in a capital-intensive model of industrial development centred on heavy goods industries. And I show, and this, of course, is an argument that has been established by others as well, but I show that the consequence of this was that the logics of industrial development and of employment generation were bifurcated. So you have a deliberate effort to create a high productivity, low employing island in the economy, which would be the driver of industrial growth, and a much lower productivity, mass employing, small scale industrial sector. And this decision meant that the early optimism of the proponents of something like the Employee State Insurance Act were disappointed that India did not expand its welfare state out from the ESI Act to cover a larger proportion of workers as they came into the formal, what we now know as the formal industrial sector. Instead, to the extent that there was a vision for a Nehruvian welfare state, this focused much more on the idea of activating a duty to work outside of the formal sector as part of what Taylor Sherman has described as a socialism of self-help, an idea that people should, well, in fact, I can use the language of the Road pamphlet produced by the Ministry of Community Development in 1957, entitled Road to the...
apologize. I was trying to respond to a babysitter.
Don't worry. The road to the welfare state, the notion that villagers should gird their loins and get down to the ground with the axe and the shovel in order to invest their surplus labour, their idle manpower in in constructive activities for the welfare of the community. So the idea of a duty to work being kind of central to a kind of project of self-sacrifice and nation building, while in the small island of the formal industrial sector, you have a very different vision and a different logic in which there is a kind of continued effort to develop forms of social protection, first from sickness insurance, we then moved to provident funds, and then an incomplete agenda of introducing unemployment insurance for the formal sector, and instead a series of restrictions on retrenchment of formal sector workers. But it's in this moment that you start to see the formalization of the distinction between the formal and informal sectors of the economy. And I suggest in the book that the project of the design of India's welfare regime is absolutely central to the way that took place. The second half of the second part of the book then turns to the story of what happens to thinking about social security in the absence of a model of mass-based industrialization, and in the wake of the Green Revolution, which drives new forms of inequality in rural India. And this is when we start to see attention turning for the first time to the need to introduce social security for the rural poor. And it's in the early 1970s, firstly in the state of Maharashtra, but also very quickly at the national level in a series of food for work programs, that we see the emergence and the expansion of rural social security in the form of public works programs of different kinds. And really from the late 1970s and the moment of the Congress defeat in the 1977 elections, the sense that multi-level electoral competition is driving the interest of different parties in these new forms of social security in order to appeal to a population of the rural poor whose earlier dependence on rural patrons were being undermined through the process of agricultural transformation in the Green Revolution. So this is the mainstay, and this, of course, is still the mainstay of a very important part of social policy in India today. But we also get, by the late 1980s, the emergence of, I think, a rather different model, which originates in the southern state of Tamil Nadu. And this is a model which is focused less on employment generation than on the design of more protective forms of social policy for those who are unable to sell their labour in labour markets for a variety of different reasons. And if you like, I would suggest that this is the kind of origins of the direct benefit transfer model of distributive politics that we see in the ascendancy in much of India today. There's much more in the book than I can do justice to on the Tamil Nadu story and the beginnings of this at that moment of policy change. But let me just turn to the final third part of the book before I wrap up. The third part turns to what happens to welfare in the context of economic liberalisation. And I suggest in this part of the book that liberalisation in India was, to perhaps a surprising degree, more of a moment of continuity in the design and spending on the social sector than seen in other developing countries that had undergone processes of structural adjustment slightly earlier than India. And part of the reason for this goes back to the story that I've sketched in the mid-20th century. The failure to complete a kind of policy agenda of social security for the formal sector, most particularly the failure to introduce a system of unemployment insurance that would have allowed industrial firms to lay off workers and re-employ them depending on profitability. The absence of an unemployment insurance policy meant that the effort to introduce a so-called exit policy as one of the first stage reforms after economic liberalisation, which would have allowed for labour in underperforming public and private sector firms to be laid off. This attempt to introduce an exit policy became a real focal point for opposition to the reforms more generally, to the idea that the poor were likely to, and workers were going to bear the brunt for the withdrawal of the state from economic policy in the context of liberalisation. On the next slide, I have just some headlines from papers of the day just to show just how controversial the exit policy became in between 1992 and 1994, leading to Manmohan Singh's decision just to quietly drop the effort to develop an exit policy, something which still remains as an unfinished part of the reforms agenda. And instead, India rather deftly uses this difficulty to renegotiate a World Bank loan, a social safety net adjustment loan, which was intended to support a national renewal fund and to help finance a form of unemployment insurance. These plans were quietly dropped, and the World Bank loan was renegotiated in order to allow India to maintain its existing social safety nets. So you don't see any you see small fall off in social sector expenditure in right in the early 1990s, but overall expenditure remains steady and picks up again. And this is kind of key part of the story, I suggest, in this part of the book, using newly declassified World Bank files on this adjustment loan. And then I end by turning to the kind of post-Congress polity and what happens to welfare from the late 90s with the advent of different kinds of national coalition government. I show that in the mid-1990s, you start to see greater interest in the provision of direct benefits, non-contributory forms of state-financed social assistance to so-called labour market outsiders, to the informal sector. This is a moment in which you really start to see the consolidation of subnational welfare regimes. And I, to some people's consternation, treat both the rights-based moment, but also the moment of liberalisation in the same chapter. And I do so to suggest that this was a period in which there was no settled consensus on the role that the state and private actors should play in the provision of welfare. You have, on the one hand, the activation of non-state and private provision of welfare enabled by the process of liberalisation, and particularly the liberalisation of the insurance sector. And on the other hand, the ascendancy of a rights-based approach to social policy, driven by civil society mobilisation and political engagement that particularly crystallised under the UPA. But I treat these two processes in the same chapter in order to underline, I think, that there has always been a contingency around both. Neither of these approaches had achieved ascendancy by 2014 and the advent of the new dominant party system under the BJP. So to conclude, I suggest in the book that India's welfare regime has in some ways been precocious. It has done things which I think are somewhat surprising if we think comparatively. In the mid-20th century, India managed to introduce a system of health insurance before a number of large advanced industrial economies, including the one we're standing in today, had managed to do this. And in the more recent phase, post-liberalisation, managed to maintain a good degree of continuity in social spending, something which didn't occur in all developing economies. I hope I've convinced you that history matters and that it helps to think historically in order to understand how the Indian welfare state has come to be designed. and that despite the neglect, I would suggest, of welfare in the wider literature on India's political economy, that there have been very long-run debates about how to design an Indian welfare state. And I have sought to convince you in the book and in some of what I've said today that the process of economic development has been absolutely intertwined with the rather stilted nature of India's structural transformation. The absence of a mass transition of workers from agriculture into industry has meant that India both erected strong protections for its small industrial workforce right after independence, and that decision created vested interests in maintaining formal sector protections and has established a gulf between the rights of formal and informal sector workers that persists to this day, leaving a highly stratified welfare regime. So thank you very much for your attention, and I really look forward to the discussion.
So thank you, Louise. Having recently read the book, I'm totally impressed by how succinctly you've summarized all the key arguments in a very tight 30 minutes. So thank you very much for that. Did we settle the order we're going in?
Everybody thinks Nisha first.
Okay.
The
least informed
commentator
first.
No,
Yeah.
please.
Yamini and Perrin have spoken.
Can we all move to the...
I think so, yeah, because the microphones are there. Yeah.
With my coat off, yeah, ridiculous smell. It is still cold. It is still cold still there. Well, thank you, Louise, for that marvelous presentation. It's, I'm hearing you present the book for the second time, but each time is quite different. So it's wonderful. As I said, the truly informed commentators will follow. I'll just make some random comments if I may. Welfare, as we all know, is at least in the Indian context, is it's an umbrella term, an all-encompassing term which accommodates a very vast range of things. From the Employees Provident Fund started in 1951, about which Louise writes, to the MGNREGA launched in 2005, from the Jan Dhan Aadhaar mobile form of cash transfers started in 2015, to subsidies that have been called reveries, and that picture was, very evocative. Of course, they're only called reveries when the opposition offers them. And historically, from midday meals in schools to even shelter homes for abandoned women. All of these, the term welfare has been and continues to be used to describe all of these quite distinct phenomena. So it's a very vast landscape that makes it actually quite impossibly hard to identify the features of a welfare regime in a way that has wide application across these many different things, these many different phenomena. And I think it is in this context that Louise Tillin's book makes two important contributions. First, as Patrick already said, this book is a first. The first historical account of the evolution of welfare policy from late colonial India to the present. And it offers an analysis not just of the relevant actors, state, capital, labor, and beyond, but also of ideas and ideational influences on the formulation of social policy, including ideas from overseas, both at the start and at the end of the book. So the spotlight on the forgotten, what Louise calls precociously welfarist initiative of contributory social insurance for industrial workers is a particularly good example of how these perspectives, looking at actors, but also looking at ideas and ideational influences, how these are combined. So I found the sections on beverage and the ILO for the early history and the World Bank for the more recent period really illuminating in this sense. Second, Louise wisely delimits her focal field to work as one, maybe the critical dimension of welfare. And as you've seen in the presentation, the book deals with the place of work and employment in the policy imagination in three different phases in which the evolution of India's welfare architecture is detailed. And this makes possible the analysis of state policy in relation to, again, what we've just seen, political contestation, powerful social forces, and institutional arrangements, including federalism. And both of these, the history as well as the delimitation to focus on work, entail navigating multiple axes of this really complex landscape: urban, rural, organized, unorganized labor, capital in labor, center and state, all of which are very skillfully negotiated. Occasionally, the book also gestures towards, if not the normative, then certainly the discursive aspects of welfare. And this is something that appeals to me personally, and those who know what I write would understand why. So I'm going to focus a little bit on this. In the early decades, welfare was couched in the language of charity. Policy documents were rife with the language of paternalism and benevolence, state largesse rather than rights. And this is of a piece with the way in which the citizen of free India was discursively constructed, with civic duty being defined as the citizen's contribution to making the nation strong and economically self-sufficient. And here I would supplement Louise's point about the duty to work in the Nehruvian welfare state, in which context I should mention that she quotes me as well. But I think it's interesting to situate this idea of duty in the context of an important motif of the time, which was the goal of self-sufficiency, especially self-sufficiency in food production. And this, of course, became even more important in the context of drought and famine in the mid-60s, when India's dependence on food aid, particularly from the United States, PL 480, which was seen as something that was deeply humiliating for the young and recently independent nation. But speaking of drought and famines, these have also long served as triggers of food for work programs. And Louise rightly traces the longer history of famine relief back to the 1880 Famine Commission, but there's actually an even longer history. So forgive me for being a little facetious, but the origin of the Awadhi Dum Pukht Biryani is traced to the famine of Awadh in the late 18th century, when Nawab Asaf-ud-Daula started massive public works constructions, including the construction of Lucknow's Bada Imambara, as a food for work program. So basically, drought, famine, food scarcity due to low agricultural productivity, and dependence on food aid were triggers not only for food for work programs, but were also an impetus for the Green Revolution itself. One way or another, the duties of work and productive citizenship definitely trumped rights. And this is the point I'm wondering whether this is some kind of a, original sin or a genetic flaw when, and Louise, I can't find my notes, but anyway, one wonders if a universalist vision of welfare, a truly universalist vision of welfare, is only possible if it is guided by the idea of welfare as a right. The language of rights has been largely absent from the landscape of welfare in India, and Louise discussed this in her slide on the Constitution. But the question is this: is it this absence, rather than resource constraints, which of course she mentioned, or a failure of the policy imagination, that has prevented successive governments over 75 years from entertaining a vision of universalist welfare provision? There is this I guess it's a cliche now, that the period from 2004 to 14 was the first time in independent India's history when welfare came to be expressed in terms of rights. But we tend to forget how weakly entrenched these were and how much consolidated power structures pushed back and in some cases prevented their full realization. I mean, we know, for instance, that capital was not enthused by Narega because of its effects on wages as well as labor availability. But this is also a brief period when non-state actors like social movements mobilize civil society, as opposed to the periods before and after, when it is industry or landed elites that have a greater role in shaping welfare policy. But even in this period, rights talk was not thoroughly universalist. It offered redress for the very large population, admittedly very large, and the most needy segments of the population, of the rural poor and those in the unorganized sector, but it was not universalist in the sense in which universalism is thought about in the context of welfare design. Right? So taking off from this, I was wondering, Louise, if thinking historically and in a discursive vein about welfare, whether we can discern a parallel between the period before 2004 and the period after 2014. Are we in this era seeing a new iteration of the charity and duty framework which prevailed in the early post-independence period? Back then, as Louise shows, a rudimentary form of social insurance, Bismarckian rather than Beveragian, of course, because it was contributory, was put in place for industrial workers. And in the countryside, like she argued, it remained the duty of the peasantry to contribute to nation building, especially, as I added, because of self-sufficiency in food production. Right? Today, despite disparagement of the reverie culture at the highest levels, the provision of free food, supplemented by cash transfers or income support of various kinds, remains a cornerstone of the welfare provisioning, combined with, once again, the duty of every citizen to participate in the project of nation building and development. Now, also to take primary responsibility for the task of improving their own lives. And the implications of this for public debt, for the fiscal deficit, have been commented upon a lot in the papers. But this is precisely what the so-called new welfarism of 2014 was ostensibly about: to substitute the idea of welfare as handouts and subsidies with welfare as empowerment. These two labels were bandied about a great deal through the creation of job opportunities. And in many statements and speeches, we saw a distinct affinity to the model of what Ian Holiday has described in the East Asian context as productivist welfare capitalism, in which the justification for welfare is not the development of human capabilities or any lofty ideal of social justice, but just an instrumental conception in which social policy and minimal social rights are subordinated to the overriding objective of making the citizen workforce productive and so enhancing economic growth. Purely instrumental. In fact, isn't this what Marx said about capitalists, and what they might do for their workers? But despite this, as it turned out, and despite all of these speeches in which these sorts of projects were outlined in the early years after 2014, that is, the reality, at least in the immediate aftermath of 2014, was ironically, or at least initially, a higher budgetary outlay for the previously reviled Narega and more subsidies, thus returning us to the charity state largesse framework, now once again overlaid by the idea of citizen duty, and in fact the idea of duty now for the first time weaponized against the idea of rights. We've been hearing a great deal, we've been chided for wasting time over the last 75 years for talking about rights and fighting for rights. We've been told that this, along with the neglect of our duties, has played a role in keeping India weak. And we know that the ceremonial boulevard of central Delhi, Rajpath, the symbol of state power, has been renamed the Road of Duty, Kartavya Path. So rights are once again displaced by duties in ways that almost suggest, the triumph of good over evil. And the language of charity for beneficiaries, labharthis, is back with welfare schemes and free or subsidized commodities being publicized with the abundant use of the personal pronoun and photographs to make the point. These are no longer the entitlements of poor citizens. They are personalized acts of charity, which diminish the dignity of the poor. So, final point on social rights. Louise, you mentioned Marshall early on, T.H. Marshall early on in the book. And I was wondering whether in the absence of a Marshallian language of social citizenship and social rights, there is another concept in that tract that we might find useful in interpreting the history of welfare in India and its dissociation of welfare from citizenship, and that is Marshall's idea of class abatement. The idea that social policy, especially in its minimally protectionist form, what you have, I think, described very well as labor commodification with social protection, whether this can be seen as a strategy to abate what Marshall called the nuisance of destitution. Right? And this might explain the irony of the new rights legislation enacted in a neoliberal economic climate, combined with or undone by a diffusion of responsibility for the actual for actual social provisioning, a commodification of public services, and all of that. And it might also explain the type of welfare provisioning that we are seeing today, reveries at election times, overlaid with duties at all times. And obviously, this form of class abatement is useful for electoral politics. So this might be a third vision of welfare in the present era, in addition to the two that Louise mentioned, and they were both on the slide. One final question, which is that the chapter, I found the chapter on the World Bank and the social safety net really valuable for the immediate post-reform period. But I was wondering if any external influences in later years had any impact. And I'm thinking specifically of the UNDP and the ILO in 2010, 11, 12. There was a great deal of buzz around the social protection flaws. And I think, as far as I recall, India was constantly trying to prove that its various schemes, from Ayushman Bharat to whatever else, were in fragmentary but substantive ways actually fulfilling the social protection floor recommendation. It was a recommendation, after all, from the ILO. So I was wondering whether these were at all significant as complementary enabling mechanisms. I'll stop there. Thank you so much for writing this book. Thank you. Now for the real stuff.
No. So I think I'm next in line, just in the sequence. So Louise, thank you. As you've already heard, Louise, this is a systematic, comprehensive, deeply researched, thoughtful, and elegantly written account of India's welfare state or welfare regimes. As Louise prefers to call it, and Nirja is always an extremely hard act to follow. But actually my comments build on hers. I'll try to be brief, and I'll just say very quickly why I think this book is important. And then, because this book is written and it's written very well, I just have a couple of suggestions, because I know, Louise, hopefully you'll continue to work on this, kind of 2 ideas for things that I hope you might write in the future. So I think this is a very important book because, as Louise mentioned, really accounts of India have been saturated and have kind of carried the hangover of this description of India as a patronage democracy. And so even as there have been really important accounts of social services, public goods provision in India in recent years, I see that they still bear the hangover because they still talk about the provision of social services through lenses of clientelism, of political parties, of under what conditions do parties provide and how they provide via brokers. And I think Louise's account kind of marks a really important, necessary, and radical shift away from such accounts to really focus on the state itself. And I think another reason why it's really important is because it really does turn on its head these dominant characterizations of India as this kind of dismal, frugal state by pointing out at least one specific dimension in which it does display this precociousness, as you call it. And I think that's that's counterintuitive, it's unusual, it's new, and it's super important. I think you also push forward the kind of general tendency just to see electoral competition as saying, where there are narrower margins of victory, there's more likely to be an impetus to introduce social welfare policies, by really looking at it again in a much more complex and nuanced way, in particular bringing in the role of federalism and state relations. And finally, I really appreciated the fact that you focus on the pre-colonial period, because somehow as political scientists, we seem to imagine that India begins in 1947. And so having an account, and I think Neerja kind of really nicely kind of made that even more layered, looking at the pre-colonial period is super valuable. And so again, I'll be really quick because I really hope we can have a little bit of a discussion. But two things that I would hope you can do in the future. And one was, maybe just an article or a book, especially because you have this ambition yourself of trying to put India's welfare regime in comparative perspective. And I share Patrick's thinking that this is a really important topic. If you could just, give us a little lay of the land of welfare more generally and where workfare figures within it. So, we get this really interesting point that at least in terms of sickness insurance for formal labor, India is precocious. But I want to kind of see maybe budgetary data, expenditures, said what all was India spending money on in decade per decade, and where does workfare figure in that? Because I just kind of want to get a sense of, because we've kind of disaggregated, because I think part of the value of the book is this kind of disaggregation of the welfare regime. And we've seen previous disaggregations. I mean, I would say that Patrick and my work has tried to push that a little bit subnationally and say, okay, not all of India is frugal. There are, areas of precociousness that's well known. I think a lot of other people have tried to make this argument that, actually India is also quite precocious, you might say, when it comes to an emphasis on higher education and technical education and universities. And where it's super frugal is actually in primary and secondary education. Similarly, health researchers have made the point that, the setting up of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, AIIMS, it's a huge thing for a kind of newly independent global south country to do that, to have that level of curative specialized care. So we might say it's quite precocious when it comes to kind of tackling specialized diseases, but very frugal when it comes, for instance, to primary healthcare. And so, it would be really nice, given your, clear skills and penchant for this kind of really granular research, if you could kind of just give us a little bit of a kind of descriptive analytic account of what the worlds of welfare regimes look like in India at the central level, perhaps at the subnational level, but at least at this kind of federal level, a timeline, like what's coming, when is coming, when, what do pie charts look like? I just kept kind of craving this kind of situation of what you were talking about in the kind of broader understanding of welfare. And again, to do that, not just for India, and it was nice to kind of see you say on the slide again that you're really interested in comparative welfare state research. Like, where does India figure in terms of Latin America? Where does it figure in terms of East Asia? So again, to tell us, are other countries, my guess is in other countries look quite different. But were there some other countries that actually put in place sickness insurance? How unusual is India's trajectory? We always see India compared to Bangladesh, like what was happening. So I think just having a lay of the land both within India and also comparatively would be super helpful. And my next and really final point is about, and actually really builds on, I think, Neerja's really incredible comments around what I think Neerja is calling discursive. And you would say, the role of ideas and the role of, not ideology really, but the role of ideas. And I think here and I'm going to just point to two kind of junctures in the book where I think this can be really brought out maybe a little bit more. And I would just love to kind of hear you talk about it. And so one is, which has already been mentioned and which you brought out, Ambedkar is rescinding this invitation to beverage you. First inviting him and then rescinding that invitation, and how that kind of really structures his insistence on kind of focusing on industrial workers, on wanting to explicitly exclude agricultural labor, and how it just kind of really, really sets up this structure of welfare regime in India. And so, and there, you kind of refer to it a little bit in the book, but for me, the role of ideas is just so front and center, because I keep going back to how, the village is this kind of site of, in some way, purity for Gandhi. It's a site of uplift. It's a site of backwardness and therefore of civilizational uplift for Nehru. And for Ambedkar, it's just a den of caste. And so his absolute suspicion, skepticism of the village, I think, and you refer to this in some ways, or maybe it's a different, distinct set of ideas that is playing into this kind of insistence on confining his attention to industrial labor force. And so I just think that, that juncture, because it is really a critical juncture in the way that we think about it, that really informs the trajectory of India's welfare regime. What are the ideas that are really influencing this actor into putting this in place is, I think, super interesting. And I think it's a great nugget that you have discovered in the archives. And it would be really nice to kind of hear you talk a little about that. Another place where I think ideology is really important, ideas are really important in it. And again, you talk about it, and it would be nice to see if you could explore this further. Again, is in that moment of the Nehru Mahalanobis plan, in which, again, they bifurcate industrial development from employment generation. And as you say, that again is this, in a way, the critical juncture has been set by Ambedkar, but, it's again a kind of point at which course could have been reversed, but they insist on sticking with this. And here again, I keep thinking about, the ideas of high modernity. Science is the god for Nehru, and temples, dams are the temples of modern India. And there's a preoccupation with science and technology, and people are a liability, or at least inconvenient and secondary. And, even you yourself on kind of page 103 have this kind of quote from Mahalanobis, and he says it so explicitly, it's kind of stunning, right? He says that we have to kind of focus on steel, cement, fertilizers. These require heavy capital. Direct employment in this would be negligibly small, and you highlight that. And we should prefer modern machinery. And he says this is not going to solve our unemployment problem. In fact, it's going to possibly make it a lot worse. And so in a context in which, everyone's in the villages, agricultural labor is where it's at, you are focusing on the industrial sector, and within that basically saying it's about machines. And this is kind of, part of this larger ideology of high modernity that is characterizing so many different dimensions in the Nehruvian period. And so I just think kind of, again, maybe bringing that out a little bit more would be really great. Like Nirja, I kept thinking, so there are ideas that are really important through the book. You refer to them. It would be great to see you kind of talk about them a little more. But also, what are the ideas that are needed for universalist welfare provision? This is, I think, a kind of, again, broader, bigger question. I think I've looked at it subnationally and said, one way in which that can happen is a horizontal, equal linguistic subnationalism. There are other ways in which it can happen. Does it have to be rights-based? I think of Mao as China, and it's not productivist welfare capitalism. There is an instrumentality, because the idea there is the Moss line. The people are required to be invested in because the people are the agents, and not just the people, it's the village people, it's the agricultural laborers who are the vanguard of the revolution. And that's where Mao really differs from Marx, in which for him, it's the rural peasantry that are the agents of revolution. And so in some senses, you can say it's an instrumental decision to invest in their productivity, or at least in their capability, so that they can be the carriers of this revolution. But there's also a kind of ideational commitment that comes from communism. But I'll stop only to say that these are some of the super exciting avenues that this book opens up. And I just feel so honored and grateful for you to have written it and for you to share it with us today.
Well, Prerna, you said you had a hard task. Now you've left me with an impossible task. What is there to say now? When both of you have so elegantly and so incisively delved into this work, but before I say whatever little I have to say, to first congratulate Louise and thank you again for writing this fantastic book. I've had the privilege of reading you, learning from you, thinking with you over several years. And as I mentioned to you, I think on one of the many times you have had to listen to me speak about your book, apologies. But I remember meeting Louise for lunch near CPR many, many years ago. And Louise said she was sitting
She had come from the archives and was kind of looking into the at Nehru Memorial Library, and was what was then Nehru Memorial Library. So it really was a while ago. And she was looking at the origins of India's welfare state. And, I sort of thought to myself, okay, we know about the origins of India's welfare state, because as someone who has been engaging with, studying, participating in the rights-based welfare effort from 2004 onwards, we all had the hubris of thinking, but that's really when it all began. So what is she doing? And everything you have done in your work has proved how important it is to actually go back into the archives and sit and really understand the origins. And it is quite alarming that it has been missed in the public discourse, not just because there are such important and fantastic nuggets that give us an understanding of how we have arrived at here. The Ambedkar beverage report story is something that has caught everybody's attention because it's just so fantastic and so incisive. But also because I think that there is the failure to understand continuities from our historical past also makes us extremely limited in the understandings of and mobilizations around what kind of welfare state India should be building. So it usually kind of, there's one end of the spectrum that will argue that, India is broken, to use Ashok Modi's book title, as if nothing has happened. And we need to, literally start from scratch. Or there is the other side of the story that too much has happened and we need to stop because this is causing huge pressures on our fiscal capacity and is simply creating a society that refuses to come to work. So in the language of freebies and raveries, this is not how a country develops, and you cannot have a welfare state before you have robust economic growth, both of which are false. And the failure to actually build a robust political debate about welfare, which steps away from announcements before elections or debates during budget about what this is going to do to fiscal deficits, comes from the fact that we've never actually engaged with the context of evolution of India's welfare state, how deeply intertwined it is with our economy and the trajectories we have and the choices we made pre-independence and post, how closely it is linked with the structure of the Indian state, its federal dynamics, and how closely and most importantly it is intertwined with the story of Indian democracy. And if you fail to understand these bits, you will fall into these binaries of nothing happened or too much has happened, both of which I think undercut the possibilities of building a society that is willing to debate the possibilities of universal welfare. So I think one of the big bottlenecks to a sensible conversation in the Indian public sphere on welfare is precisely this failure to understand the intersection between welfare and nation building, both economy, state institutions, and crucially the democracy, which is the foundation of it. And until we are unable to get past that, we won't be able to move forward to having a serious conversation. And so in that sense, I think Louise, your work is not just crucial for advancing our academic knowledge and engaging in a more substantive way with comparative welfare regimes, but also I think it plays a really crucial role in at least serving as a very important corrective so that there is some foundational basis on which we can have a deeper and more constructive public debate and eventually, hopefully, a political debate on the future of welfare in India. So I just wanted to kind of say how important this is from that perspective too, because we often lose that, in academic conversations, the role of the intersection between academia and shaping public debate and in the public sphere is often missed. I thought what I do in my remarks is also to kind of draw on what I have learned from your work, to talk a little bit about how I see the welfare state in the current moment, because I think again it reiterates the importance of of work like yours, which shows us both the continuities but also the ruptures. And a lot of what I'm going to say builds very much on what both Neerja and Prerna have said. But I think it shows also how helpful it is to anchor present moments in history, but also raises very important questions for us as we go forward, which again resonate with what has already been said. So I think first and foremost, as you rightly remind us, welfare in India has been very closely intertwined with work, but not in the way in which welfare has been theorized globally in terms of its relationship with work. Right, as we were discussing in this afternoon as well, India's precocious welfare state or welfare regime is very much an outcome of building welfare in an economy that has incomplete commodification of labor, and it focuses in its initial phase very much on the formal sector of the economy. It in fact entrenches this bifurcation between formality and informality, which we see both in terms of how it has shaped and undermined the possibilities of a serious conversation on labor capital relations in the formal economy. So when we talk about labor laws in India, it is always shaped it is actually increasingly shaped as something that is fundamentally at the heart of what is undermining the possibilities of formalization of the Indian economy. That the fact that even formal parts of the economy prefer contractualized labor is entirely on account of this rigid structure of social insurance and labor laws that were built out in the pre-independence and early post-independence era, but also that it kind of saw welfare in informality. The role of welfare was essentially to be compensatory. So in the Nehruvian era, you speak about it in terms, you remind us how much this is intertwined with this idea of duty to work and participation in this larger project of nation building. But essentially, it does it critically breaks the relationship between welfare and work, or welfare and labor market, which endures very much into the present. So we have this kind of brief era of rights, which I'll come back to in a moment. But let's look at where we are today. As your historical work rightly points out, the choices we made in that immediate post-independence era on the economic trajectory meant that the vast majority of India was to wait for the benefits of heavy industrialization to reach them, and in the meanwhile perform their duty to work, with some limited amounts of thinking about welfare, where state capacity, in this context very much fiscal capacity of the state, served as a convenient constraining factor to the kind of welfare that the state could build up in that phase. So Nehru does a little bit of this community development stuff, which is really just a sideshow. And I recently read Neerja and I both as part of our book jury, the biography of Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, and I was reminded very much also of how so, a lot of this community development is also built into how do you accommodate for many of those who are participants like Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay in the freedom movement, who have a different sensibility of where and how economic empowerment or economic trajectory should be built. And so, the Khadi industries, the Khadi Gramodyog, all of that is kind of handed over to this part of the nation building, all linked to this idea of community development, but not really seen as a core integrator into the economy. In today's India, fiscal capacity is no longer the constraint. It simply cannot be politically viable because we have now had 3 decades of relatively decent amounts of growth. But we've never been able to solve the unemployment problem. The formal economy still grows very much distinct to what is happening in the rest of the economy. And where formality and informality come together, it's really in the context of all those rigid laws that prevent the informal from becoming formal. So it prefers to stay hidden. And to compensate for that, we have built out because fiscal capacity is no longer a constraint, no politician can go to the hustings without actually having built some amount of welfare into their politics. But it really is very much a compensation for an economic imagination that is simply not going to be able to, they're simply not interested in generating jobs for most. So from being a duty to work, we today have a welfare that is a compensation for an economy that is not interested in generating work. And in a sense, it is seeking to demobilize workers by keeping them compensated with whatever minimal amounts of cash and other forms of subsidy that are provided. And that really is the battlefield of electoral competition. I'll give you 2,500 rupees, you will give me 5,000 rupees. And that's kind of where it begins and ends. And that brings me to the second piece of this, which you don't talk about, state capacity. One of the reasons why, so Nirja asked a very important question. So in terms of the ideas post-liberalization, we hear, so the World Bank plays a very important role as you described. But I think into the contemporary moment, there's another story about state capacity, or rather what we perceive as state incapacity. And in order to address state capacity, cash transfers, a way of bypassing the state entirely, serves as an important tool to be able to generate welfare. And this acquires deep legitimacy in public policy schools like this. That plays a very important role in generating the ideas of what do you need to do to deal with the state capacity problem. And this form of welfare transfer is one that can address this state capacity problem, the problem of leakage, the problem of corruption, all of which is, again, imagined very much from the point of view of demobilizing the worker and keeping the worker outside of a collective mobilizational demand for welfare. So I think, thinking also about how the big development economic ideas around efficiency, markets, technology have all played a role in shaping where we are today, coming together in this idea of compensatory welfare in the context of entrenched unemployment, which is seeking to demobilize so that the structural questions of the Indian economy don't enter into the formal politics. And I think there's something here that we need to unpack more seriously. The second, and I'll just say two more things, one on federalism and one on citizenship. A lot of what I have learned from your work, both in this book and a lot of your other work on federalism, tells us a lot about the interplay between subnational welfare regimes and national policy. And I have often wondered, aloud to myself, if I think of all the most powerful pieces of welfare that have come into play, midday meals, national rural employment guarantee, frankly, even these cash transfers that are the flavor of the month, they all have their roots in subnational welfare regimes for very specific subnational politics that creates them. But very often, the very same actors that are building out these welfare regimes at the state level also use state level experiences to mobilize for resources at the center and therefore for these schemes to become national. And what that does is inherently centralize the whole process of welfare delivery. So in fact, we have a very important tension that is emerging from federalism leads to innovation, experimentation, and all a response to local politics. It also creates opportunities for national politics and nationalization. But in that process of transfer, it centralizes. And because our fiscal federal architecture is built around schemes, and bureaucrats in India, Rajivji will say more on this, are very effective at thinking about schemes and not very effective at thinking more broadly about policy. Everything becomes schemized, I suppose. And then we are talking about central government 60%, states 40%, and central government showing up with its... I've literally sat in these meetings and watched IAS officers sitting on a podium like this from Government of India. State governments will come, present their planning action budgets, and then the Secretary Government of India will say, absolutely not. That is not our priority. I am not going to fund that. I will fund my priority. And so it becomes, so how do we kind of think about this centralized, decentralized tension? And in the era of direct benefit transfers, which every state is struggling with precisely the same problem, in fact, it serves the purpose of further centralizing because you don't need local institutions, the local state and the local intermediaries, which brings me to my last point on citizenship and rights. As Neera rightly said, that 2004-2014 phase was a very precarious building of a rights framework for which there was never a political consensus. So as social movements enter, they shape elite politics, but that elite politics doesn't actually translate all the way down into the grassroots. And that has always, again, been a tension, which then links to why it was so easy to dismantle the regime of rights and introduce the regime of duties through this idea of the beneficiary as a labharti. And I call it in my work techno-patrimonialism, a phrase that I owe to Patrick, precisely because technology allows you to bypass all these local sites of bargaining and ensures that the citizen becomes the recipient, the labharti, and continues to feed the idea that in a context of an economy that is not going to address its structural constraints to generate jobs for all, it is best to have a demobilized voter who is effectively the labharti that receives a few crumbs, performs their duty vis-a-vis the state, but without actively demanding and seeking welfare. So, the precariousness of rights from in that 2004 to 14 phase also needs to be better understood. And my contention is that it may have something to do with the fact that it was in fact an elite imagination and not one that percolated through the structures of politics into grassroots mobilization. So again, all of these to say work that looks at history and allows you to then think of the present from that perspective raises deeper and more important questions and hopefully will help us have a much more dynamic debate on welfare in India that isn't caught between broken and freebies and raveries, but really deals with the realities of what we confront in our economy and our democracy.
So that was truly extraordinary, which I think speaks to how just important the book is, right? To get such incredible comments. And there's so much on the table here, and I'm sure Louise is chomping at the bit to respond. But I'm going to suggest that we take a round of questions because we only have 20 minutes and we do have a hard time constraint. And I'm going to completely abuse my authority and ask the first three questions and then open it up. So with apologies, but I'm too excited to ask these questions. So first, this is absolutely amazing, but there's one word I didn't hear at all, and it's the word caste. And I want to raise it because if one thinks about the U.S. welfare state, it is the weakest, the least inclusive welfare state in the OECD world. And the answer in a word is race. From Ira Katznelson to a huge literature, we know that Social Security, other benefits were never really made universal because of the race problem, right? I could make the same argument for Brazil. South Africa has always had a welfare state. It was a welfare state for white people. The problem then was extending it to blacks. And in the Indian context, I would simply point out that in the states where the caste issue was first addressed, they now have more comprehensive welfare states, right? So Tamil Nadu, Kerala. And then there's Myron Weiner, famously, and I love this book, ages, The Child in Poverty, why is there so much child labor in India? And his answer is essentially, because the elites don't give a shit. And they don't give a shit because of the caste system. And maybe that's part of the story when it comes to the limited nature of the welfare state. The second point is we always talk about welfare as extending welfare to the poor, right? But and I'm not trying to be sarcastic here, but we've always had welfare for elites. If welfare is the provision of public goods, the number one beneficiaries of public goods provisioning in India, whether it's simple service delivery in cities, right? The planned neighborhoods get public goods, the unplanned neighborhoods don't, or whether, as Perna was pointing out, it's the education system and the over expenditure on higher education and the complete neglect of primary education, and the same argument as you made for Ames. There's been a welfare state, but it's been a form of what Chuck Tilley always called opportunity hoarding. Right. And so much of the resistance maybe to expanding the welfare state has its roots in the particularist nature of the precocious welfare state. And then a third point, and this is one of the things I love about the book. At first, I didn't get the Making India Work title of the book, to be honest. And then I read the book and now I get it. And essentially running throughout the structural problematic, of course, is this bifurcation between the formal and the informal. And when you think of India in comparative terms, Latin America has a huge informal sector, but it's 40%. In India, you always hear 80%. I've heard as much as 93%, right? And God knows what the actual number is, et cetera. But there's no doubt that the preponderance of the informal sector, this is the main structural problem, right? And there have been so few policy efforts to actually address this directly. And so I just want to pose that question. So, for example, minimum wages is an obvious way to sort of deal with some of the problems in the informal sector. States in India notify minimum wages all the time, and they're never implemented, right? Simple things like giving domestic workers collective bargaining rights. So it's not expensive, actually, to formalize the rights of informal sector workers to have rights and be collective bargaining. So I just love to invite you to say more about the structural persistence of the problem of the informal sector. Other questions? I'm going to start in the back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Get to you.
Thanks, Louise, and the panelists. Such an extraordinary, rich discussion and so much food for thought. So thank you all. This is what's happening today, at least as I see in Bangalore, and I'm sure it's happening in many other cities as well, is the influx of young men and women from neighboring districts in two kinds. On one hand, you have the self-employed programmers, men and women who kind of consult with and make a decent income, whereas you have others such as the Uber drivers and the Swiggy delivery and Blinkit 5-minute delivery who are completely informalized, as Patrick had mentioned, in services, right? So it's also the expansion of retail, the retail sector, where you have a lot of these sales boys and girls who are basically coming out of agriculture, presumably from these smaller districts around surrounding Bangalore, and then kind of have absolutely no social security, no pensions, nothing at all, right? So in the future, I see this kind of expanding more and more, and we talk about India's demographic dividend, and this demographic dividend seems to be going into Uber and Swiggy and these kinds of informal services. So kind of more generally, to kind of quote Prerna here, what do you think are the ideas that are probably needed, or even to kind of pick up on what Yamini said, what is the future of welfare in this case when it's not compensatory, but we're looking more at pensions and social security in the future. So that's it. Thank you again. It was incredible.
What a historically magisterial overview. Thank you. And to look for some silences in the presentation is almost an act of scholarly unkindness, but allow me a certain lack of grace. Two silences which could be there in the book. I bought a copy I have not been able to read, so I apologize. I have a copy. The two silences, one has been mentioned, but I'll start with simply welfare in rural India and welfare in caste. I will build upon what was said. So in 1951, India was 82.7%. The workforce was 82.7% in rural India and 17.3% in urban India. there is no concept of welfare state possible in this kind of division of labor force unless we put rural India centrally into a conception of welfare. May I suggest that Nehru had actually a welfare idea in his head, and that was land reforms. He knew that capital-intensive planned industrialization will not generate employment, and therefore the so-called transition, the so-called great agrarian transition from the countryside to the city will not happen until multiplier effects have come into place, which could take 7 to 8 years or so. Land reforms was the way from the problem of rural misery will be handled. And he actually put it in the 9th schedule. It was not, once courts challenged it, courts nullified his land reform legislation on grounds of right to property. He took it to the 9th schedule of the Constitution, which is not judicially challengeable. And this idea of welfare failed because land reforms could succeed. Land reforms as an economic program ran up against the political needs of the Congress Party, which is a process very well understood.
Louise does make this point in the book.
Yes. So it could be there in the book. I mean, it could be there in the book. But land reforms was India's welfare conception in the 1950s, an idea that failed, except in Kerala later, much later, 1970s, but very, very little land reform went through because of the political problem. Land reforms, landed elite were the base of Congress Party in the countryside. That was the problem, right? So that's one. The second on land, on caste, this is an Ambedkarite idea, but it's not only Ambedkarite. There is a real development of this idea in southern India, which is welfare as dignity enhancement. Right? The lower castes, Ambedkar is talking about it in a certain way, but the others talking about it in a different way. But the idea is lower castes it's not that they don't need income, but most of all, they need dignity enhancement. They need to be treated as human beings with equal dignity, and that would lead to a better situation for them. Right? Maybe you've talked about this in the book, which I have to read. There must be something there on land reforms as well as there. But these two, it seems to me, India's welfare conception has to deal with these two problems. And perhaps you have. So, let me leave it at that.
Well, we have 10 minutes, which is not much given the comments, the panelists, and the questions you've gotten. But Louise, the floor is yours.
Thank you ever so much. And I can't begin to say how much I value your comments. Yeleni, you've managed to say an entirely new set of things that you haven't said in previous discussions. Thank you. But also to Nirja and to Prema, who's popped out. I have learned such a tremendous amount from all of you in thinking about the welfare state. So it is such an honour to have you all discuss the book. So thank you. And thank you too to colleagues in the room for your reflections. It's very hard for me to do justice to everything that's on the table. So I'll just cherry pick a few points for reflection. And perhaps begin, Patrick, with your kind of emphasis on the structural problematic of the formal and the informal in the Indian economy. I always kind of knew that the way that the size of the formal sector in India is typically measured is the proportion of the workforce covered by ESEC and the Provident Fund. But it was really only in the course of writing the book that I realised just how central the story of welfare has been to the hardening of that formal-informal divide. And perhaps, replying to where Prerna was pushing me as well to situate India's story comparatively, it is very interesting, I think, that that preponderance of the informal sector has been so stubborn in India, especially compared to parts of Latin America. I think, for instance, of Candelaria Garay's work on social policy expansion to informal sector workers. And that was, I think, bound up with a kind of a movement of formalization in the economy. I know earlier discussions with colleagues in Brazil just how struck they were about the extent of informalization in India. So I do think that the kind of those foundational moments of welfare state design are really crucial to understanding how stubborn it has been. And perhaps to kind of think through some of where Yamini left us, and Siddharth too, in the question that you ask us about what a kind of future welfare state might look like. I think, this is part of the crux, really. We are now at a juncture where some of the story I tell in the book is being unwound. So there is a diminution of some of the labour protections that were introduced for formal sector workers. We've seen this in Gujarat and Karnataka recently with erosions of working hour protections, for instance, as part of a kind of competition to attract Chinese capital or capital that might otherwise invest in China in India. And of course, a set of debates around the need for new forms of social policy for gig workers, most recently with legislation in Karnataka, preceded, of course, in Rajasthan. And as I said in my remarks, ongoing efforts to try to extend things like the employee state insurance, sickness insurance scheme to the informal sector. So we are, I think, at a real moment of inflection, of course, through the labour codes as well, but a kind of an important moment of policy, I think, inflection about how to think about social policy across the informal and formal sector divide. Yamini and I have been ideating much of the day about how we might push some of this debate forward. So I hope this is a conversation that we will continue. I can't claim to have the ideas, all of the ideas here and now. Perhaps I might just pick up the point about universalism and rights as well, because I think this is something that many, Nirja and Prana and others have spoken to. And the kind of the question as to whether universalism hinges on rights, whether more productivist, if you like, ways of thinking about the function of social policy necessarily undermine or are different to or at odds with a rights-based conceptualization of social policy, I think is something that has kind of resonated across time. I remember being quite struck, for instance, in reading some of the debate around the National Social Assistance Programme. So the debates that were happening in Tamil Nadu about a move from employment generation as the mainstay of social security towards a more protectivist understanding of social security, which is where the kind of rights-based conception of social policy comes from, right? So that people have rights independent of their position within vis-a-vis the labour market. And the kind of the persistent notion that India just couldn't afford this model of welfarism, and that so this kind of productivist way of thinking about the function of the state vis-a-vis welfare has been incredibly persistent, and it's absolutely connected to the insistence on duties as opposed to rights. But again, I do wonder whether in the present moment, and again, this is something that Yamini and I have been talking about, whether there is also a need to go back to interrogate what that productivist model for welfare looks like or might look like in the Indian economy. given the structural problem of unemployment. And one of the consequences, I think, of the discourse of duties rather than rights, and in a way, a consequence of the lack of an instrumentalist understanding of welfare in the mid-20th century, was the decision to underinvest in education and health. And if you were designing an industrial policy fit for mass employment, then you might think about welfare very differently. And that was a subject for debate. In fact, Ficky themselves, in their alternative vision for a welfare state, pointed to that as the right function for the state, in a mass employing industrial model. So I do think this is a moment to kind of think again about that productivist conceptualization. It's not only about the direct provision of employment or making people more productive in order to drive industrial profits. It is also a discussion about investment in human capital and social development, something, of course, that Werner has written so importantly about in her book on solidarity and welfare. And to the absences, caste is relatively absent in the book, and that was something that I was very conscious of. It was a conscious decision because there is, of course, a much bigger literature on caste and welfare as social justice. But of course, it is absolutely central to understanding welfare in its widest sense, and I hope that people will weave it into the story that I tell in the book.
On that note, thank you all. This was absolutely extraordinary. Please join us. We have a little reception just outside, and we can continue the conversation.